Croeso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 198, Richard Price, Enlightened Revolutionary. So as we are approaching in 2 episodes, our 200th episode, I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have a question and answer podcast we are going to do for that. I have received some questions already, but more would be really wonderful, and I look forward to answering them and to talk about kind of where the podcast began, where it's going, and everything in the future. So thank you all who listen. Thank you for your tremendous help, and your comments are always appreciated. Today we're going to focus on a man of Welsh birth who was a figure of importance to many during the revolutionary period in America and France. This is a gentleman who you may not have heard of before, just simply because he's not seen as a larger light compared to some of the others that were around in this period. But I would argue, I think he's an important figure in the English descent movement, and as well as an important figure in Welsh history. So he's someone we do need to pay attention to, and I do want to focus in specifically just on him today. Richard Price was, as I said, a figure in the English descent movement. This, of course, was a movement we mentioned in the last episode. Outside of specific historical circles, in other words, people who have interest in that era, he's generally considered to be relatively unknown by compared to all of those who came around that time. It was a crowded field of philosophers and religious men who were trying to figure out where they were in the world, and scientists, and so many fields of study kind of exploded that it's hard to sort of focus in on one or two, which is why we've generalized for the most part. But Price was born in 1723 on Tintern Farm in the Garw Valley. His family were and had close ties to Samuel Jones, who had been a part of the emerging Puritan movement in Wales during the 17th century in the English Civil War. But this group was forced into hiding, of course, after the restoration of the Stuarts. With the support of Price's grandfather and others, Jones was able to establish a meeting house, Garw Valley. That would continue to be the tradition in the spirit of Orthodox Calvinism. Through this, Price would be taught, at least by his father and other people in the faith, but he would particularly reject this particular version of Protestantism. His father, Rhys Price, removed his son from a dissenting academy which he had been attending in Pentwyn in West Wales because of his concerns about the ideas that he was being exposed to by more radical nonconformists who were different than and not in line with the Puritan beliefs that were professed by Samuel Jones and his version of Calvinism. Richard was then sent to Talgerth, and under the tutelage of the renowned Vavasor Griffiths, but by then Richard had already made his mind up where he stood religiously. Price and his father would, according to the stories, often come into conflict due to Price's willingness to read works of other Protestant faiths, which disturbed his father, so much so that in one case, while reading an Anglican book, it was taken out of his hands and thrown into the fire. That was the level of distrust and dislike that his father had for that particular church. The philosophical background and the discussions that were had back and forth obviously helped to develop Price's logical arguments and his base philosophy. And he also, of course, did schooling in various traditions, which would also influence his point of view. Obviously, his problems with his father had built up in him an understanding of faith that was quite different than what his father was advocating, and it would influence his life going forward. When his father died and his mother soon after, Price took responsibility for looking after his sisters before he eventually followed other members of his family to London. Eventually, he was appointed a Unitarian chaplain for George Stretfield and his family, and became an assistant to Samuel Chandler, a well-known dissenting minister. It would not be long before Price found himself at home and began to exert influence in London. He became a focal point for the dissenting community when he took up his role as minister in Newington Green Meeting House. By that time, both Stretfield and Price's uncle, who had welcomed his nephew to London, had passed away. So Price was making his way as an independent man in the world, having then married Sarah Blundell, who was, somewhat surprisingly, a lifelong member of the Anglican Church. So again, pointing out the various religious influences within various Protestant sects that were affecting him. It was during these early beginnings that Price published one of his first works, a review of the principal questions in morals. This was published in 1757. Price challenged prevailing moral sentimentalism, the view that our emotions are the basis of ethical judgments, as supported by Francis Hutcheson and David Hume, figures that are fairly large in the community. This idea of rationalism worked with his political ideals, which were developed through his radical worldview of the late 18th century. To quote Price from one of his works, the chief blessing of human nature are the three following: truth, virtue, and liberty. These are, therefore, the blessings in the possession of which the interests of our country lies, and to the attainment of which our love of it ought to direct our endeavors. By the diffusion of knowledge it must be distinguished from a country of barbarians. By the practice of religious virtue it must be distinguished from a country of gamblers, atheists, and libertines. And from the possessions of liberty it must be distinguished from a country of slaves, something which we'll come back to in a bit. These ideas seemed very different from the almost conservative and somewhat backward worldview which were represented at the time, and to some of us today, don't actually seem that progressive, but in that era would have been massively progressive. And this was in a period of social upheaval. The ideals of the French Revolution in particular terrified European monarchies to an extent that it galvanized them in a way they had never been prior to this. As mentioned previously, the English, or rational dissenters, of which Price was a member, emerged during the 18th century, and their core values tended to coalesce around a particular set of ideals and principles that were, in the broadest term, progressive in nature, at least in comparison, as I said, to the majority at the time. Price gave a great deal of help to John Howard in his preparation of his book, The State of Prisons. After the death of Thomas Bayers in 1761, he edited his papers on the principles of probability. This apparently led to Price's interest in the principles of insurance and premiums. Funny enough, he was a consultant to a Society of Equitable Assurances on lives and survivorships, and so he was effectively an insurance accountant. He was responsible for ensuring that the Equitables were the first ever office to ensure that premiums depended on the age of the assured and that they were sufficient to meet future commitments. He was supportive of the idea that the pension for the elderly and sickness benefits should exist, and in 1789, a House of Commons committee invited him to prepare a table for this very purpose. Rationalists spend a lot of time trying to show that the scientific proof of faith and the ideals around religious concepts were not based necessarily on things that couldn't be explained. This meant that everything was examined initially on the basis of how it would offer proof behind all that had happened within the pages of the Bible, from the global flood to the six-day creation, and how miracles could logically be explained. Going back to Thomas Baynes, with the help of Price, they created a probability theorem, which it has been suggested was inspired in part, and did inspire, both the establishment of mathematical proofs for the existence of miracles, but also went even farther than that. To be clear, that was the assumption at the time, obviously not exactly applicable these days, but understand that was kind of their thought process. Bryce was then elected as a Fellow to the Royal Society for his work amending, expanding, and bringing the theorem itself to light. Some academics have suggested that Bayes' work in probability had an immense influence on areas involving statistical inference, including in the development of the internet and artificial intelligence, if we were to take it to the modern examples. The idea of science deployed in the service of progressive political agenda reflects a wider culture that had broader impacts on the contemporary society, as well as the appeal beyond its context for religious dissent. It's important to remember that during the Enlightenment, even as there were atheistic and humanist viewpoints being expressed through science, there was a great deal of focus points about science as it related to deity, and to understand it through religious worship as a part of the general cycle of religion. And so I think when we look at these things and we evaluate them, we have to context them in that. Price, through his religious background and his understandings of science and nationality, would author a Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790, which is one of his last prepared written documents, which was a part of a defense against Edmund Burke's attacks of various things, including the French Revolution. And it is through this that he is portrayed as being someone who is very much on the opposite side of Burke in these discussions. As Price is seen as a part of secular scientific community, it was always his ideal to examine under that lens what was religious belief. His religious understanding informed his ideas on both politics and ethics, but also, because of the way in which it inspired his relentless activity, his Christian beliefs also affected his understanding of how science worked and how social welfare would work. And thus, in one of his later works, he expressed himself saying, "Our Lord and his apostles recommended that universal benevolence, which is unspeakably nobler principle than any particular affections. They have laid such stress on loving all men, even our enemies, and made an ardent and extensive charity so essential to the part of virtue, that the religion they have been preaching may, by way of distinction from all other religions, be called the religion of benevolence. Nothing can be more friendly to the general rights of mankind, and were it duly regarded and practiced, every man would consider every other man as his brother, and all the animosity that now takes place amongst contending nations would also abolish."
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
Today, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's podcast, Caldera Lab. Caldera Lab offers you an opportunity, if you're like me and you're getting older and you're finding your black spots under the eyes or wrinkles around and laugh lines, things that might bother you as you're aging and make you feel like you are older than you really are, Caldera Lab has formulated a number of products to help with that and to help make your day easy and simple, something that, we all want. Their regime includes 3 products, including the Clean Slate, the Base Layer, and the Good. Clean Slate starts and ends your day. It's a face wash to help refresh your skin. The Base Layer is a daily moisturizer to hydrate your skin. And the good is the go-to multifunctional serum at night, which helps your skin look tighter and smoother, as well helps to reduce the visibility of wrinkles and fine lines. And the Caldera Lab Icon Eye Serum addresses the three common skin concerns around the eye: fine lines, dark circles, and puffiness, which I know I've had quite often. It is a leader in men's skincare and made only with top ingredients, and clinical trials have found that 94% of men's skin showed an overall younger look in appearance after using Caldera Labs for just a few weeks. So with that, we have a special exclusive offer. It's probably the best offer available. If you use the code Welsh History Pod, all one word, at calderalab.com, you will get 20% off right now. Get 20% off with the code Welsh History Pod at calderalab.com and make an unforgettable first impression that leads to the charming words, "You look younger." As I mentioned previously, Price's moral philosophy can be seen as a critical response to the sentimentalism of empiricists such as Hume and Hutcheson. As far as Price was concerned, their approach, which foregrounded emotional reactions and rendered morality as a subjective and psychological matter, subject to the individual whim, whereas Price himself believed that moral judgments occupied the same realm as mathematical truths and are universal, permanent, and unconditional. Therefore, moral values and truths were something that even exceeded the divine, something that was driving thought for many in this era. All of this, of course, would heavily influence the drive and philosophy of Price politics, built on his ethics with an emphasis on freedom, virtue, and knowledge. He would advocate for freedom of religion from the state interference, something very popular in the dissenter community. To him, all religious tests for public office encouraged persecution of nonconformists, and then created a habit of lying to avoid persecution by that government. This would interfere with conscience, which is a private matter between the individual and his deity, not something that should be front and center to decision-making on jobs. Toleration is simply inefficient and insufficient. It implied that society recognizes one creed but tolerates others. Full freedom should be extended to all religions, not just different Christian denominations. Thus, a very big difference from some of the other Protestant scholars of his day. This cry of separation from church and state was intrinsic to his values. As you can imagine, so much of the humanist Enlightenment belief of the 18th century were at the center of philosophy of those fighting verbally during the War of Independence for the United States. Human liberty, rights of man, taxation only with representation in the political decision-making was increasingly being expressed in society, and it was forcing those in power to deal with these concepts. In the midst of these debates, Price would, in the 1770s, become a strong advocate for the Americans and their War of Independence. His radical values, of course, fit well with the arguments of Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, as well as others. In fact, Jefferson and Price would carry on letters to each other even after the separation of the United States. According to Price, the legitimacy of government stems from the consent of the governed. Price argued that people retain the right to alter their form of government as they wish. Direct democracy, in his view, was the most desirable form of government, but of course, in larger state democracies, it needed to have representative government, which of course is what most democracies are today. He would write a number of pamphlets in defense of the colonists and these rights, something that would transition into a defense of French citizens in the early days of the French Revolution, as he saw it as similar to the Glorious Revolution in Britain against the rule of James II. In Price's pamphlet, which supported the American War of Independence and the Revolution in France, he would continue these radical Republican ideals. He would die in 1771 before the outbreak of what would then become the Terror, which might have colored his beliefs and maybe changed them in ways, but certainly his base ideals continued to be in support of people deciding for themselves. The best known of his various pamphlets was A Discourse on the Love of Our Country, which was published in 1789, 2 years into the French Revolution. Price's sermon was also a mature statement of the most important aspects of his political philosophy, presenting arguments and themes that still resonate to this day, and of course, are the culmination of his thoughts and ideas that he had been creating over the last 20 to 40 years, depending on how long you want to go back to it. His views on civic nationalism were some of the earliest expressions of a more modern nationalism based on the idea that the, quote, that the body of companions and friends and kindred who are associated with us under the same constitution of government, protected by the same laws, and bound together by the same civil polity, end quote. This thought is very different from the role previously of a subject in a monarchy. As a member of the community marginalized by the Test Acts, as well as a Welshman who obviously would have seen his own level of discrimination, Price articulated an ideal of nationality away from the gentrified medieval level of obligations which start from the monarch to the peasant, but instead grew from the people to the monarch. As mentioned in his quote earlier, Price saw nationalism as a way to create unity and understanding, not separation by patriotism. To him, nationalism can only be valid and legitimate when it's held in check by reason and by sympathy for our fellow human beings, a rational argument which completely ignores the general tendencies of human beings, of course. He also became an advocate for the abolition of slavery, something that he also considered to be abhorrent. He believed the Americans to be wrong in their support and sustaining of it, and called them out for it. To someone who often talked about the evils of national slavery, it would make a lot of sense that he saw it as something that should not exist at the personal level as well. Price's personal politics emphasized that citizens must be active and not passive in their governments. That is their duty to challenge leaders and to hold them to account for their actions. It is part of their rights as humans to be active participants in politics and policymaking, which determines a lot of what would affect people. Likely this is why he had so much affinity for the arguments of those of the Enlightenment advocates like Thomas Paine. We have talked a little bit about the philosophy of Price, but we have yet, with that, to speak about his Welsh origins or his Welsh cultural background. In part, that's because most of his life, especially his adult life, was spent in London. Yet, we know that he was involved in the broader community, as previously expressed, and may have still spoke at least some Welsh. His upbringing certainly was one of reason, and it was why he was so fiercely loyal and willing to stand for his religious beliefs and ideals. And it was the defense of these rights of the minority that colored his ideas on equality, whether it be through the population or via economics. So without a doubt, he still kept in his heart an understanding of the Welsh experience. He still lived his life in Wales and still understood the basics of the struggle of being a group that were not on the inside for the most part. And it probably continued to give him a reason to fight those that would argue otherwise. And during his time, he would actually carry out correspondence with Thomas Jefferson and others of the Revolutionary Fathers. And specifically in a letter dated October 26, 1788, he said the following when talking about what had been going on in France and America. Quote, "What is now passing in France is an object of my anxious attention. I am by no means properly informed about the nature and circumstance of the struggle, but as far as it is a struggle for a free constitution of government and the recovery of their rights by the people, I heartily wish it success, whatever may be for the consequence to this country. For I have learnt to consider myself more of a citizen of the world than of any particular country, and to such a person every advance that the cause of public liberty makes must be agreeable. For this reason, I have been made very happy by the adoption of the new federal constitution in America. This constitution meets my ideals in most of its parts, and I have been trembling under the apprehension of its rejection. Without doubt, it has defects, but it may be well hoped that time and experience will afford the means of removing them." End quote. Richard Price may be relative unknown by modern history standards, but his contributions were very much appreciated by people who remained key to what we understand as the modern world. His relationship with America, his relationship with his fellow Welsh expats, colored his concept of what this world should be. His understandings and love of liberty and a love of the people and the society and how to protect it colored his religious viewpoint. It made him into an important figure, so much so that many English philosophers and writers in the later periods of the 1800s would, if not use him, would certainly be inspired by him to write some of the things that they would come to write. And his arguments still carry to this day an important level of sympathy and understanding for our world and for its people. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. If you have any other comments you'd like to make, you can always make it either at Twitter at Welsh History Pod or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. We are currently on Instagram at Welsh History Pod. So if you want to check that out, I've been uploading photos of various places I've been in Wales. I may run out of pictures after a while, but at least I'm posting some stuff up from museums and interesting locations. As well, if you would like to help out the podcast through financial means, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for listening. Please don't forget that we are looking for questions for the 200th episode coming in just over 4 weeks. And thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a great day. Hello. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.
History is the greatest adventure story. But does it ever leave you wondering what the women were doing all that time? This is Lori from the Her Half of History podcast, and the answer is that some women were seizing power, or escaping slavery, or spying for their country, or creating artistic masterpieces, while countless others were doing the laundry, getting married, and wondering why their clothes don't have more pockets. If you would like to hear the stories of women doing all of those things, check out Her Half of History at herhalfofhistory.com or wherever you get your podcasts.